The cabin lights died. Not flickered, completely died. Flight to 34 from Denver to Los Angeles, carrying 189 passengers and 8 crew members, lost power in a way that shouldn't be possible. No lights, no instruments, no communication. Just darkness and the sound of confused voices filling a metal tube, falling through the sky at 35,000 feet. Then the flight deck door opened. A paramedic stepped out. Pale and trembling, she walked through the cabin looking for anyone who could help. She found a quiet boy sitting alone in seat 1F. He was 9 years old. He had a handheld gaming device, and he was about to become the only person on that plane who could bring everyone home. Drop a comment below right now, where in the world are you watching this from? And make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story gets even wilder. Let's go. Marcus Webb didn't look like someone who would matter in a crisis. He was small for his age, with oversized headphones and a dinosaur backpack that had seen better days. His mom had packed him a window seat on this flight, his first time flying alone, to visit his dad in California after the divorce. The flight attendant, a woman named Joyce with kind eyes and practiced warmth, had checked on him 3 times already. "You doing okay, sweetie?" she asked, crouching down so they were eye level. Marcus nodded, barely looking up from his game. "I'm fine, thanks. If you need anything at all, just press this button, okay?" She pointed to the call light above his seat, speaking slowly like he was much younger than 9. Marcus had heard the same speech from his mom 100 times before he left. Everyone treated kids like they were made of glass. In the cockpit, Captain David Reynolds and First Officer Susan Chen were having the kind of conversation pilots have on routine flights. They've flown 100 times, weather updates, fuel calculations, small talk about weekend plans. Reynolds had been flying this route for 12 years. Chen had just made First Officer last month. It was supposed to be a smooth afternoon crossing the mountains into California. "Looking good up here," Chen said, scanning the instruments. "Should be down in Denver in about 3 hours, with time for a late dinner. Can't wait." Reynolds smiled. "My wife's making her famous lasagna." Neither of them knew that this particular flight would be their last routine afternoon. What nobody on that plane knew was that Marcus Webb wasn't just a regular kid playing games. His father, Thomas Webb, had been a commercial airline captain before a massive heart attack forced him into early retirement. Thomas had survived, but his dream of flying hadn't. When the divorce papers came through, Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone. He wanted to share his passion with his son. He wanted Marcus to understand the world that had defined his life, so he got creative. Marcus's game device wasn't really a game. His dad had loaded it with Aviation software, while other kids played Minecraft. Marcus studied flight systems, instrument layouts, and emergency procedures. It started as something to keep Marcus connected to his dad during the separation. Thomas would video call him and ask questions like, "What's the first thing a pilot does if they lose hydraulics?" Marcus would answer correctly, and his dad would light up like his son had just won an Olympic medal. But it went deeper than that. Thomas was obsessed with preparation. "The world is unpredictable, buddy," he'd told Marcus during one of their calls. "But knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you. If you know what to do, you can do it. If you don't, well, things get complicated." So Thomas had built a miniature flight simulator on his laptop. When Marcus visited on weekends, they'd spend hours in the garage while his dad's new girlfriend pretended not to notice the unusual hobby. Thomas would walk Marcus through scenarios: engine failure on takeoff. What do you do? Loss of cabin pressure. What's your response? Both pilots incapacitated. What happens next? Marcus had rolled his eyes plenty of times. "Dad, when would I ever need this?" "Hopefully never," his dad would say. "But if you ever do, you'll thank me." Marcus had thought his dad was paranoid. Now, sitting in seat 12F at 35,000 feet, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The first sign was subtle. Marcus noticed it during a particularly intense level of his game. Though he wasn't really playing a game at all, the cabin's gentle hum changed pitch. It was small, so small that most passengers wouldn't notice, but Marcus had spent enough Time in his dad's garage to recognize the sound of electrical systems shifting. He looked up from his screen. The overhead lights were the same brightness they'd been for the last 2 hours. The air conditioning still hummed. Everything seemed normal. But at WASN single quotes T. Up front, Captain Reynolds had noticed something on his instruments. A warning light that shouldn't be lit. He frowned at the display. "You seeing this?" he asked Chen. She leaned over. "Main electrical bus shows a fluctuation. Probably nothing. Could be a sensor glitch." But then another warning appeared, and another dot in the cabin. Flight attendant Joyce was stacking empty cups from drink service when she felt the plane's systems do something strange, almost like a hiccup. She paused, listening. Everything sounded fine, but something in her gut told her it wasn't. She picked up the intercom to the flight deck. "Captain, this is cabin crew. Everything okay up there?" Static answered her. She tried again. "Flight deck, cabin crew, do you copy?" Nothing but dead air. Joyce felt her stomach tighten. She picked up the backup phone. Still nothing. That's when the cabin went dark. Not gradually, all at once. Every light in the aircraft simply stopped working. The emergency lighting flickered. On a moment later, bathing the cabin in a dim, eerie red glow. Passengers gasped. A baby started crying. Someone whispered a prayer. In the cockpit, Reynolds and Chen were staring at a nightmare scenario. Every display had gone dark except for the emergency backup instrumentation, which was only showing basic altitude and airspeed. All their communication systems were dead. The autopilot had disconnected. They had no idea what was happening. "Emergency power?" Chen asked, her voice tight. "Already tried," Reynolds said, flipping switches with increasing desperation. "Nothing's responding. It's like someone turned off the entire electrical system." What they didn't know was that the aircraft had encountered an extremely rare phenomenon, a combination of atmospheric electromagnetic activity and a critical failure in the main power distribution system. Every primary electrical system had failed simultaneously. The backup systems were working just enough to keep them flying, but barely. Reynolds took manual control of the aircraft. Without instruments, he could fly it visually, but only if it stayed at this altitude where he could see the horizon. If they descended into clouds, they were flying blind. "We need to declare an emergency," Chen said. Reynolds reached for the radio. "Mayday, mayday. This is flight to 3 for Denver." Nothing. The radios weren't working either. "All communication systems are down," he told Chen quietly, for the first time in his career. Captain David Reynolds felt genuine fear. The electromagnetic pulse that had knocked out the aircraft's systems wasn't finished. It intensified, sending another surge through the cockpit. The sudden voltage spike and the rapid change in cabin pressure as a seal failed in the flight deck sent both Reynolds and Chen into immediate unconsciousness. Their bodies went limp in their seats. The aircraft was now flying on backup power, alone enough to keep the engines running and the plane in the air, but nothing else. No autopilot, no communication, no navigation systems. Just a large aircraft held up by its momentum and the basic physics of flight. In the cabin, Joyce felt the pressure change and heard an alarm sound briefly before cutting out. She knew something catastrophic had happened. She moved quickly toward the front of the aircraft, her training kicking into survival mode. When she opened the cockpit door using the emergency override, she saw the pilots slumped in their seats. Her heart stopped. She checked for pulses. They were both alive, but completely unconscious. She placed oxygen masks on their faces and then had to make a decision that terrified her. She had to tell the passengers what had happened. Joyce moved back into the cabin. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She had to stay calm. These people were looking to her for answers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention," she announced. "We are experiencing a serious technical emergency. Our pilots are temporarily unable to fly the aircraft. I need to know if anyone on board has pilot experience. Anyone at all." The cabin went silent, then panicked. Passengers looked at each other with terrified eyes. A woman in business class spoke up. "Can't we just land on autopilot?" "The autopilot isn't functioning," Joyce said. We need someone to manually control this aircraft or we won't be able to land safely. Does anyone have any flight training?" A man in first class stood up. "I flew in the military 20 years ago. Small planes. I've never flown anything commercial. Please come to the flight deck," Joyce said, relief flooding through her. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then, from the back of the cabin, a quiet voice spoke up. "I know how to fly." Joyce turned. A small boy with a dinosaur backpack was standing up in seat 1-F. "Sweetheart, sit down," Joyce said gently. "The adults need to handle this." "But I actually know how," the boy insisted. His name was Marcus, and his voice was shaking but determined. "My dad taught me. He's a retired pilot. I've trained on simulators. I know the emergency procedures." "But I actually know how," the boy insisted. His name was Marcus, and his voice was shaking but determined. "My dad taught me. He's a retired pilot. I've trained on simulators. I know the emergency procedures." A passenger laughed a nervous, panicked laugh. A kid. "You're joking, right?" "I'm not joking," Marcus said. He was terrified, but something his dad had told him kept echoing in his mind. "If you know something that could save lives, you have an obligation to speak up, no matter how scared you are." The military veteran looked at the 9-year-old. "Sorry, kid, but I got this." But as they entered the cockpit, the veteran immediately felt out of his depth. The instrument panel was overwhelming. Modern jet cockpits were nothing like the small planes he'd flown decades ago. He recognized some basic instruments, but the layout was completely foreign to him. "Can you identify what these are?" he asked, pointing at various displays. Joyce looked at him, then back at Marcus. She made a decision. "What's your name?" she asked the boy. Marcus Webb." "Marcus, come with me." Walking up the aisle toward the cockpit, Marcus felt like his legs didn't belong to his body. He was 9 years old. This couldn't be real. But the fear on the faces of the passengers around him, the way they watched him pass with desperate hope, made it very real. The cockpit was exactly like the simulator his dad had set up, except much bigger and with actual unconscious people in the seats. Marcus's hands were trembling, but his mind was clear. His dad had drilled emergency procedures into his brain so many times that they felt automatic. "Can you really fly this?" the military veteran asked skeptically. Marcus moved to the first officer's seat and began scanning the instruments systematically. He read them aloud, just like his dad had taught him. "Backup power only. Altitude 35,000 feet. Heading to 170 degrees. Airspeed for 120 knots. Fuel showing approximately 7,500 kilograms remaining. All engines running normally. Main electrical systems offline. Backup systems operational but degraded." The military veteran stared at him. This was not a child guessing. This was someone reading instruments with confidence. Joyce leaned against the cockpit wall. "How long can we fly like this?" Marcus did the math quickly, something his dad had drilled into him during every training session. "At current fuel burn rate, approximately 2 hours and 50 minutes. Can you land this plane?" Joyce asked quietly. Marcus took a deep breath. "I've never landed a real aircraft, only in simulators. But I know the procedures. The main problem is we have no radio, no navigation systems, no ground support. We're completely on our own." "We're what?" the military veteran asked. "Flying Nordo," Marcus explained. "No radio. Aircraft do it when their communication systems fail. But normally they still have transponders so air traffic control can track them. We don't have that either." Joyce nodded slowly. "Then we're invisible." "We're invisible," Marcus confirmed. "But we can still land if I can find an airport I can see." Joyce looked at the two unconscious pilots, then at the 9-year-old boy who had just told her the situation. She made another decision. "Okay, Marcus, you're flying this plane." "Sir," she addressed the military veteran, "you sit in the other seat and help me monitor instruments." "Marcus, what do you need?" Marcus placed his small hands on the control stick. He could barely reach the rudder pedals with his feet, but he could manage. His father's voice was so loud in his head now that it almost seemed like the older man was in the cockpit with him. "When crisis strikes, your conscious mind panics. But if your hands know what to do, They'll do it automatically. First, Marcus said, his voice surprisingly steady. I need to take manual control. The autopilot is already disconnected. I'm going to feel how the aircraft handles. Then we descend and find an airport. How? The military veteran asked. Visual navigation. Marcus said simply, we follow landmarks. It's how pilots flew before. Modern technology existed. It's our only option now. He reached down and gripped the control stick firmly. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but he pushed the fear down. Later. He'd be scared later. Taking manual control, he announced, and gently moved the stick. The aircraft responded immediately. For a moment, Marcus felt overwhelmed by the weight and responsiveness of the real plane compared to the simulator. Then muscle memory took over. His hands had done this hundreds of times in practice. Now they did it for real. She's responding, he said, mostly to himself. Okay, I'm going to reduce power and begin descent. Target altitude 12,000 feet for visual navigation. Marcus pulled the throttles back carefully. The engines responded with a deep rumble as they transitioned from cruise power to descent power. He pushed the control stick forward gently, and the nose of the aircraft dipped. The descent began. In the cabin, passengers felt the change. The aircraft was going down. Hope and terror warred in their chests. Some closed their eyes. Some prayed. Some gripped the armrests so hard their knuckles turned white. At 28,000 feet, Marcus leveled off momentarily. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the landscape beginning to take shape below them. Mountains, desert, the sprawling geography of Arizona spreading out beneath them like a map. Where are we? Joyce asked. Marcus studied the terrain carefully. We departed Denver heading west. We've been in the air approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. Based on our heading and speed, we should be somewhere over northern Arizona. Can you find an airport? The military veteran asked. I have to, Marcus said simply. He descended again. Dropping through 20,000 feet, the aircraft shook slightly with turbulence, and Marcus's hands moved constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep the plane steady. His training screamed at him to stay focused. His fear screamed at him to do something, anything to make this easier. He ignored both and just flew out at 15,000 feet. He spotted something, a city, relatively large, with the distinctive network of highways and streets visible from altitude. He recognized it from maps his dad had shown him. That's Flagstaff, Marcus said, pointing. I can see it on the chart. He pulled out the sectional chart that was still in the first officer's seat and traced their position. If that's Flagstaff, then Flagstaff Pulliam Airport should be just south of the city. Let me look for it. He descended further, his eyes scanning the terrain. The military veteran provided altitude readings as Marcus had instructed. Joyce stood in the doorway, watching this 9-year-old boy fly a commercial aircraft with a level of concentration that seemed impossible for someone so young. Then Marcus saw it. The distinctive crosshatch pattern of runways, the airport buildings, emergency equipment scattered around the tarmac. There, he said, that's our airport. How do you know? Joyce asked. Because I recognize the runway pattern from my training, Marcus explained. And look, emergency vehicles are already gathering. Someone must have noticed us on radar before the systems went down. They know something's wrong. Marcus circled the airport at 8,000 feet, assessing wind conditions and choosing his landing runway. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, despite the fact that he'd never done any of this in a real aircraft before. I'm going to set up for approach, Marcus announced. This is going to take about 10 to 15 minutes. I need absolute quiet in the cockpit unless I ask for something. Can you both do that? Joyce and the military veteran nodded. Marcus took a deep breath. He'd done this thousands of times in the simulator. He'd trained for this moment his entire life, though he'd never imagined it would actually happen. Now it was real. Beginning approach to runway 03, he said. Left. Downwind approach. He banked the aircraft in a wide, descending turn, setting up the classic landing pattern his father had drilled into him. His small hands worked the controls with precision. Throttle adjustments, control stick pressure, trim wheel corrections. At 6,000 feet, he called for airspeed. 280 knots, the veteran reported. Too fast, Marcus said. He pulled the throttles back further. The aircraft slowed. At 4,000 feet, Marcus extended the flaps to the first landing position. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the wing flaps deployed. More drag, more lift, slower flight. Turning to base leg, Marcus announced, banking the aircraft perpendicular to the runway. The runway was now visible off to his left. Marcus judged the distance, counting down in his head like his father had taught him. 3 seconds, 2, 1. Turning final approach, he called out, banking left again. Suddenly, through the windshield, the runway appeared directly ahead, a long stripe of concrete stretching out before them, getting larger every second. On final, Marcus breathed, extending. Landing gear. He moved the gear lever down. The aircraft shuddered as the landing gear descended into position. Through the instrument display, 3 green lights confirmed all gear were down and locked. Flaps full landing, Marcus commanded himself, extending the flaps to maximum. The aircraft slowed further, now flying at approximately 130 knots. The runway filled more and more of the windshield. Marcus could see every detail now, the painted numbers, the threshold markers, the individual cracks in the concrete. Altitude 1,000 feet, the veteran called out without being asked. He was learning to anticipate what Marcus needed. Airspeed 125 knots, he continued. On glide path, Marcus felt the aircraft's descent rate. Everything was perfect. Everything was aligned. The runway was directly ahead. At 500 feet, Marcus began the most critical phase of landing the flare. This moment separated successful landings from crashes. Too high and the plane would stall and drop. Too low and they'd impact hard enough to damage the aircraft. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. His hands gripped the control stick with absolute certainty. Altitude 300 feet, the veteran reported, his voice tight. The runway was rushing up to meet them now. Marcus could see everything in high detail. 200 feet, the veteran called. Marcus began pulling back on the stick, raising the nose. The aircraft's descent rate slowed. 100 feet, the concrete was so close now. Marcus could see patches and cracks. 50 feet, Marcus pulled back on the stick with more authority. The aircraft's descent slowed dramatically. For a moment, they seemed to float over the runway, suspended in space. Then with a solid thump that jolted everyone in the cockpit, the main landing gear touched down. The impact was harder than ideal, but the landing gear held. The aircraft bounced slightly, came down again, and this time stayed down. Wheels down. The military veteran shouted, but Marcus wasn't finished. The aircraft was still traveling at over 90 miles per hour down the runway. He needed to stop it. Thrust reversers, he said, pulling the throttle levers into reverse position. The engines roared, creating reverse thrust. Brakes, Marcus commanded himself, pressing down hard on the brake pedals with all his strength. The aircraft decelerated rapidly. Friction smoke rose from the tires. The whole aircraft shook from the violent deceleration. But it was working. Runway remaining. 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet. The airspeed dropped. 60 knots, 40 knots, 20 knots. With 700 feet of runway left, the aircraft came to a complete stop. Asterisk for 3 seconds. Complete silence filled the cockpit. Then Joyce started crying great heaving sobs of relief. The military veteran slumped in his seat, shaking uncontrollably. And Marcus Webb, 9 years old, slowly released his grip on the control stick and began to tremble. You did it, Joyce whispered. My God, Marcus, you actually did it. In the cabin, the silence broke. Passengers erupted in cheers and applause. Some were crying. Some were hugging the strangers next to them. Some simply sat in stunned silence, not quite believing they were alive. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Paramedics rushed aboard to attend to the unconscious pilots. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen were beginning to regain consciousness, groggy and confused. As they were carried on stretchers to waiting ambulances, Marcus was led from the cockpit by Joyce, still shaking, still trying to process what had just happened. As he emerged into the cabin, passengers stood and applauded. Some reached out to touch his shoulder as he passed. Others simply stared in amazement. "You saved us," a woman said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved all of us. You're a hero," a businessman told him, his voice breaking with emotion. Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted, scared, and desperate to hear his father's voice. When he descended the aircraft stairs, he was met by airport officials, emergency responders, and a quickly growing crowd of people. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters shouted questions. An FAA official approached him. A serious-looking woman in her 50s, "Young man, I need to speak with you about what happened up there," she said. Marcus looked up at her with tired eyes. "Am I in trouble?" Her expression softened. "Trouble? You just accomplished something extraordinary. We need to understand how a 9-year-old was capable of flying and landing a commercial aircraft." Over the next several hours, Marcus would repeat his story multiple times. His father's training, the flight simulator in the garage, the emergency procedures that had been drilled into his memory so many times they felt automatic. When his father, Thomas Webb, received the phone call, he wept. He wept for the fear his son had experienced. He wept for the knowledge that he'd been right to prepare him. He wept for gratitude that his son had lived through it. By evening, Marcus's story was international news. 9-year-old boy lands commercial jet after pilots incapacitated. His face appeared on every news channel, every social media platform, every newspaper in the world. The aviation community was divided. Some praised his quick thinking and skill. Others questioned whether a child should have such knowledge. But for Marcus, the most important moment came when his father arrived at the airport. Thomas Webb moved his wheelchair quickly through the crowd. When he reached his son, he pulled Marcus into the tightest embrace he could manage. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice breaking. "But I also hope you never have to do that again." "Me too, Dad," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. "Me too." Over the following weeks, investigators determined that the electrical failure had been caused by a rare combination of factors. Solar activity had created unusual atmospheric electromagnetic conditions. An undiscovered manufacturing defect in one of the aircraft's main power distribution units had created a vulnerability. When those two factors aligned at exactly the right moment, it created a cascade failure that knocked out nearly all of the aircraft's primary electrical systems. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen both recovered fully. Reynolds spent weeks talking about the moment he regained consciousness in a hospital bed with no memory of anything. After trying to contact air traffic control, Chen was grateful to be alive, though she admitted she struggled with the knowledge that a 9-year-old had done her job better than she could have in that moment. Both pilots made it a point to meet with Marcus and his father privately. Reynolds shook the boy's hand with genuine tears in his eyes. "You saved my life, son. You saved all our lives." Marcus received a commendation from the FAA, the youngest person ever to receive such recognition. He was invited to aviation conferences. He appeared on talk shows. He received letters from around the world, but the attention made him uncomfortable. He was still a 9-year-old boy who wanted to play with his friends, ride his bike, and be normal. The fame felt suffocating. 6 months after the incident, Marcus sat with his father in the garage, surrounded by the flight simulator equipment and aviation manuals that had prepared him for that extraordinary day. "Do you regret teaching me all this?" Marcus asked. "Do you regret pushing me so hard?" His father looked at his son carefully. "Never," he said firmly. "Marcus, you were prepared when the world needed you to be prepared. That's all any parent can hope for their child. But I was so scared, Dad. The whole time I was terrified." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," his father explained. "Being brave means doing what needs to be done even when you're absolutely terrified. You did that. You were brave." Marcus looked at the simulator setup. "I don't think I want to be a pilot anymore." "Is that okay?" His father smiled. "That's perfectly okay. You've already proven you can fly a commercial aircraft better than people with decades of experience. Now you can choose whatever makes you happy. Maybe you'll be a doctor or a teacher or an engineer. It doesn't matter. You'll always know that when it mattered most, You were capable of something extraordinary. I just want to be a regular kid. Again, Marcus said. Then that's what you'll be, his father promised. But Marcus Webb would never truly be a regular kid again. He was the boy who at 9 years old had taken the pilot's seat at 35.0 feet when the sky went dark. He was the boy who had saved 189 lives through knowledge, courage, and a father's belief that preparation could matter. The story of Marcus Webb would be told in aviation circles for generations, not as a miracle, but as proof that extraordinary capability can come in the smallest packages, that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody expects, and somewhere in the sky, on routine flights between cities, pilots would occasionally look at young passengers and wonder, could another Marcus be aboard? Could another child be quietly carrying knowledge that might one day save lives? The answer, as the world had learned, was yes. Heroes come in all ages, and sometimes the smallest hands can guide the largest machine safely home.